So well, I wanted to say venerable, sorry, Professor Stephen Kerry from Australia, Queensland University. I'm happy that you are here, and please, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jabba. It's good to see everybody. Yes, so hi, my name is Dr. Stephen Kerry. I am in Australia, so it's the evening here. I understand some people are in the morning, for some people in the afternoon, so wherever you are, hello. So I, I won't go over too much in an introduction. I'll just maybe jump straight into my presentation tonight, if that's okay. So in recent years, there has been a distinct backlash against trans and sex gender diverse people in many Western countries, as Jump and I were just discussing beforehand. For example, in Britain, the former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, emphatically claimed that we shouldn't be bullied into believing that people can be any sex they want. They can't. A man is a man and a woman is a woman, and that's just common sense. In North America, there has been an increase in anti-trans laws and the politicalization of gender-affirming care. And this has caused some concern here in Australia, which is not surprising considering that there was a public appearances of the British anti-trans activist Posey Parker alongside neo-Nazis on the streets of Melbourne. In addition, a group called the Lesbian Action Group applied for an exemption under the National Sex Discrimination Act to host an event restricted to female-born lesbians, which was rejected. The fact that hard-won laws and policies that protect trans and sex gender diverse people can be so easily challenged and in some cases undone in Western countries emphasizes the importance of giving voice to discrimination wherever it appears. And to that end, this paper draws attention to the issues facing trans and sex gender diverse Buddhists. The last few years, I've been doing interviews with Australian queer Buddhists and in particular trans and sex gender diverse Buddhists. And it is clear that they continue to face discrimination within their Buddhist communities. While some trans and sex gender diverse Buddhists speak of difficulties that they have had in non-Western Buddhist traditions, so-called ethnic Buddhism, others have also experienced difficulties in Western Buddhist traditions such as Triratna. Triratna is one of the largest Western Buddhist organizations in the world and was founded in 1967 by Sangharakshita, an openly gay English-born Theravada monk. Despite emerging at the height of the counterculture revolution, Triratna reinforces a segregation of gender in its study groups, meditation retreats, lay ordination, and as a result, members are divided into women's wing and a men's wing. Smith and colleagues describe Triratna as binary and heteronormative and state that the binary separation of the sexes within Triratna also continues to make the position of trans people unclear. They also claim that this is in part due to the approach taken to trans issues by its founder. And this is a view that was shared by Annie, a trans Buddhist that I have interviewed. And Annie told me that the separation of sexes stems from Sangharakshita's interactions with Michael Dillon in the late 1950s. So Michael Dillon is widely mentioned in the trans literature as the first trans man to undergo phalloplasty. He is also the first foreigner to become ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk. Dillon was born in 1915 to a British father and an Australian mother. His mother died shortly after childbirth and his father died 10 years later. As a result, he and his brother were raised by two aunts. At 19 years of age, Dillon enrolled at Oxford and studied classics. Here he started to bind his chest, smoke a pipe, ride a motorcycle, and wear men's suits. He captained the women's rowing club and attended boxing matches, which women were not allowed to do. After Oxford, Dillon worked in a laboratory, and at that time, he heard about Dr. Foss, who was prescribing synthetic testosterone for women suffering from severe menstrual symptoms. Dr. Foss agreed to give Dillon testosterone on the condition that he consulted a psychiatrist first. However, this psychiatrist outed Dillon, and Dillon was forced to leave the laboratory and take up a job in a garage. While working at the garage, Dillon continued to take testosterone, and he wrote Self, a study in ethics and endocrinology. This was a treatise which was eventually published in 1946, arguing for the greater empathy for patients who wished to change their gender. However, yet Dillon did not reveal his own gender history. After being on testosterone for several years, Dillon underwent a double mastectomy in 1942, and this was performed by a sympathetic plastic surgeon who encouraged Dillon to formally change his name and also put him in contact with Dr. Gillies, a surgeon known for his surgeries on intersex patients and injured soldiers. In 1944, Dillon legally changed his name, and in 1945, he enrolled in medical school as Michael. Over the next few years, Dillon underwent 13 surgeries, which left him with what's referred to as a crude and badly scarred penis and scrotum. Graduating from medical school in 1951, Dillon began working as a doctor for the British Navy. That is until 1958, when Dillon was again outed, this time by the news media. A Sunday Express magazine reporter noticed that in one of the British peerage publications, Dillon was listed as the heir to the baronetcy of Lismullen in Ireland. Yet in another publication, there was no heir, instead naming Dillon's birth name. Dillon was devastated by the publication of the story, and as a result left his position as a Navy doctor and disappeared into India. This is when Dillon met Sangharakshita. So Sangharakshita was born Dilys Lingwood, and during World War II, he was stationed in India and was inspired to take up meditation. And he did so in his barracks at night, seated cross-legged inside the mosquito curtain while the other inmates of the room slept. After leaving the army, Sangharakshita returned to India amidst the violence of independence and began traveling for 2 years. He was ordained as a novice Theravada monk. A year later, he was given full ordination as a bhikkhu. He would live in India for a further 14 years. After meeting Dillon, Sangharakshita ordained him as a novice monk, also in the Theravada tradition. However, after a few months, Dillon began to waver in his interest in both the Theravada Buddhism and also Sangharakshita. Dillon had met several Tibetan lamas and became attracted to Mahayana Buddhism. He underwent so-called lower ordination in Tibetan Buddhism. And in doing so, it is here that he becomes the first Westerner to be ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist monk. Dillon was interested in full ordination, which the Tibetan lamas were prepared to do. However, Dillon was once again outed, this time by Sangharakshita. While the Tibetan lamas agree that Dillon's gender history was no impediment to ordination, they recommend that his full ordination be postponed to wait until the noise died down. Dillon's full ordination never took place because he died a few years later. Sangharakshita defended his actions on the grounds that there are prohibitions against anyone belonging to the third sex being ordained. That a trans man was publicly outed by an openly gay man illustrates a broader antagonism which existed between the so-called different species, to use Michel Foucault's term, in the 1950s. Joanne Meyerowitz argues that some gay men sought public acceptance by foisting the stigma of transgression onto others. And Meyerowitz also argues that some gay men and lesbians believed that homosexuals would win respect more readily if they refrained from challenging the norms of gender. It is possible Sangharakshita outed Dillon because, as a gay man, he possessed an inherent distrust of Dillon because he was trans. Smith and colleagues notes how Sangharakshita continued to see Dillon as a woman despite his sex change, and so saw Dillon as fundamentally unable to enter an all-male community. Dillon's autobiography, called Out of the Ordinary, was not published until 54 years after his death. And in it, he speculates that Sangharakshita was furious that I should receive full ordination so quickly. Dillon also notes that Sangharakshita defended his action by saying it was his duty in order to protect the Sangha and monkhood. Dillon is here referring to the Vinaya, and Sangharakshita's Theravada Buddhist tradition adherence to its bans on various types of people from receiving high ordination. In the Vinaya, it is part of the Pali Canon, and it is a list of prohibitions of sexual activity for Theravada monastics. Roger Corliss suggests that this is a long list of prohibitions because the monks were so inventive in looking for loopholes. Leonard Zwilling suggests that the prohibitions for monks outnumbered those for nuns because sexual relations between women were not an integral part of the social fabric in the way that male same-sex relations were. And as a result, nuns did not concern the authors of the Vinaya in the same degree. It is generally agreed that the Vinaya categorizes humans into 4 sexes and genders: men, women, hermaphrodite, and Padanka. However, more recently, the term Padanka is used as an umbrella term for all non-normative sexes, genders, and sexualities. And Jose Cabezon proposes that the term Padanka is synonymous with the contemporary term queer. In the Vinaya, there are many attempts to conceptualize the varieties of Padanka, and the purpose of these conceptualizations is to regulate their interactions with monastics and to regulate their access to the Dharma, and as well as prevent them from ordination. Janet Gyatso has identified other historical Buddhist texts which also attempt to exclude Padanka from knowing the Dharma. And these texts state that Padanka should not meditate, they should not be taught or preached to, and they are not able to understand the Dharma at all. According to Cabezon, preventing Padanka from ordination is meant to reinforce the Sangha as an ideal social sexual group comprised exclusively of real men and women, an ideal community composed of nothing but dimorphically gendered, anatomically and psychosexually perfect human beings. One could argue that Sangharakshita's move to stop Dillon's full ordination is transphobic. However, we must be cautious when we apply contemporary terms and concepts retrospectively. Another possible explanation for Sangharakshita's actions is that the Theravada Buddhism tends to be more rigid when it comes to the Pali Canon and thus Vinaya. It is often stereotyped as the so-called the religion of the book. And Mahayana Buddhism appears to be more lenient. as evidenced by the Tibetan Lama's reaction to Dillon's gender history. So yes, Dillon was outed by a psychiatrist, a journalist, and a Theravada monk. Dillon and his transition were also supported by his two aunts, his co-workers at the garage, several doctors, and the Tibetan Lamas. Dillon died in North India in 1962. In addition to Self and his autobiography, he published several books. And in 2020, Oxford announced a new lecture series called the Michael Dillon LGBT Plus Lectures. I've been following Buddhism, the Buddhist path, for about 23 years. And I really wish I'd known about Michael Dillon when I started, or at least a little bit earlier. It's only been recently that I've learned about him. And it's only also been the last year or so I've learned about Guanyin, a trans icon, which I'm not going to talk about tonight. So trans and sex gender diverse Buddhists have a history. And as the title of this year's conference says, Buddhism is trans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this beautiful talk.